I want you to imagine first that your job every day is to move objects from one coloured box to another coloured box. Every hour on an electronic device you're given a target for how many objects you have to move. You don't get to speak with anybody else about that target. You barely have time to take a break, to go to the toilet, for example. You're not allowed to have a telephone. And in general, you should have the minimum amount of contact with your other workers. Now that you've imagined that, perhaps imagine working in the same company, but as a manager of such people, who needs to make sure that all of the workers are trying to meet their targets, that they're sufficiently disciplined to not take too long of breaks. Maybe imagine that your other managers are constantly criticizing you, that you have interactions with them, but those interactions are highly competitive, that there's all kinds of mechanisms where those other managers can try to undermine you, even to the extent of making up stories about you're not doing your job properly, and that you might get emails at midnight, and if you don't respond to them, you start to get text messages telling you that you should be responding. These invented stories, you'll have recognized characterizations of some working conditions in companies like Amazon is the most famous, other companies in the gig economy, or maybe in some call centers. And the question that I want us to reflect on, that I want to pose, is not so much about whether such working conditions are acceptable. I happen to think they're probably not, but that's not the main question I want to pose. It's rather whether working in such conditions all day, spending indeed most of your waking time in such working conditions, affects the way you think about your relationship with other people, your place in society, and indeed your ideas about politics. I'll suggest that asking such questions, at least in a moment of technological revolution affecting our economy, would seem to be a very important political priority. And yet, if we look at the way the European Union is thinking about the future of the European economy, these questions about the quality of work and type of work are getting lower and lower priorities. Just yesterday, in Brussels, there was what they call a high-level conference on the future of work. When they say high level, it means that the people who are there consider themselves to be very, very important, rather than it took place at a very high level. But the kinds of priorities at that conference were basically about how to provide the necessary skills in the workforce for the new kinds of jobs that are emerging. And this way of thinking about the future of the economy is quite different to how the European Union was thinking at the turn of the millennium, for example. As part of the Lisbon strategy, which was the European Union strategy from the year 2000 to 2010, there was a slogan of more and better jobs. The important thing there is also better jobs. By the time we got to what was called the Europe 2020 strategy in 2010, the concern with better jobs had totally dropped out. The important thing was more jobs. Of course, what happened following the year 2000 and before 2010, so from the Lisbon strategy to the Europe 2020 strategy, was a financial and economic crisis hit the European Union. And the priority of the European Union over those years, 2008, 2009, 2010, and so on, became, let's say, twofold. Primary one was fiscal responsibility, and a secondary one would perhaps be fighting unemployment or trying to return to growth. And so this concern with the quality and nature of jobs became much less of a priority. But perhaps ironically, at the same time, the increased attempt at fiscal control and oversight coming from the European institutions posed and continues to pose all kinds of questions about how the European economy is governed, and in particular, if and how it's governed democratically. So in particular, following the Greek crisis, Greek debt crisis in 2015, there has started a debate about the democratic shape of the European economy, which is very much focused on the Eurozone, because there's a tendency to think that the main problem is about the structure of the euro, which already limits the self-questioning about the democratic shape of the whole European economy. But various proposals have been made about which go some way towards bringing more accountability, at least, if not more democracy, to Eurozone governance, notably the proposals of Emmanuel Macron to have a Eurozone finance minister, proposals that we read about in the newspapers in France, I don't know whether anybody else reads them, Piketty to have a Eurozone parliament, and these kinds of things. So people are thinking about how do we have a more democratic Eurozone or European economic governance. But these questions, this is very much focused on questions of fiscal responsibility and eventually growth, and cutting out, I will suggest, a whole series of other questions. One of the main reasons, as you know, that the European political elites are beginning to question themselves and their strategies is what they name the emergence of populism, the breakthrough of various popular parties. Think of Cinque Stelle in Italy, or La Lega Nord, La Lega as they now call themselves, in Italy, or Orban, what's happening in Poland. These are very different phenomena, but as you all know, they tend to be gathered together in the idea that there's a populist revolt, and so the political elites are asking themselves, what ought we to do differently to address this? Now, various sociological studies, notably the work of Herbert Kitschelt and Philipp Herrmann. Herbert Kitschelt is a great specialist on post-Soviet economies, as it turns out. But various sociological studies have shown, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the conditions under which people work and what kind of jobs they do all day, every day, does indeed affect significantly their political attitudes, or appears to. And moreover, that changes in the nature of the workforce can seem to promote what could be classified as populist or authoritarian values. What those two sociologists in particular did was to look at the results of the European Social Survey from 2008, which was a survey of a large part of the European population from all the different countries, and map the occupations of the people to their political preferences. And what they were able to quite convincingly demonstrate was that broadly, if your work involves interpersonal contact, speaking with a client or a patient, for example, and in a certain sense working together to come to a common result, or if your work involves experimenting, where you can't be sure how best to achieve the result, so you need to find a solution for a problem and maybe work with your team, or there's some degree of uncertainty, your work involves either of those two things, it's likely that you are more welcoming to strangers into your group, and that you are less concerned with imposing strict behaviour on members of your group. On the other hand, if your work involves constantly following strict orders with very little choice about what it is you ought to do to achieve your result, and involves little or no contact with other people, there's a tendency to prefer politically authoritarian structures and closed groups. Now, of course, neither those sociologists nor I are suggesting that there's anything inevitable about doing a certain kind of job and having some particular political opinions. First of all, even if working takes up a significant amount of our time, it doesn't consume our whole lives, and there's all kinds of other influences over the way we think about things. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly for my purposes, workers can come to an evaluation of their own working conditions. So they may very well be subject to very strict controls and repetitive work, but instead of taking that as a model for how their society ought to be organized, they may decide quite the opposite and come to a realization that maybe this form of work is unacceptable in various ways, may even organize themselves to try to do something about it. While what I'm pointing to clearly has relevance to the third industrial revolution and the increased role of technology and all of these phenomena which perhaps increase tendencies for highly repetitive impersonal work, workers organizing to address dehumanizing working conditions is, of course, a long-standing feature of the European economy. So it might be a good idea to look at the new forms of workers organizing that are happening in the newest parts of the economy, to see how workers themselves are seeking to understand, address and improve their working conditions. And so an example which I think is suggestive is the Amazon strikes, which now happen regularly on Amazon Prime days, which is when Amazon tries to have reductions, or on Black Friday. I don't know whether that exists here, but it started in the US. It seems to have reached at least France, from what I can tell. Maybe it's also come to, on Black Friday there's a discount. And there's regularly Amazon strikes happening right across Europe on those days. The ways that came about were through Amazon workers working across countries and learning from each other how to have an effective strike in Amazon. In 2013, Amazon workers in Germany tried to go on strike, but they realized that Amazon simply moved the distribution work to warehouses across the border in Poland, and so were able to get around the strike. So the following year, the German workers had some meetings with Polish Amazon workers, actually while they were on a common Amazon training course in London, and decided that they ought to work together. And so by 2050, there was a coordinated strike between the German Amazon workers, organized in rather traditional German trade union Verdi, and Polish workers working with a brand new Polish trade union, collaborating together. What's interesting about these forms of workers' organization in the gig economy in particular is that they're typically cross-border. They're very often sociologically when we look at them, led by women. Very often, at least in Western European countries, in the UK, France, Germany, migrant workers play a very important role in the organisation. And the forms of collective organisation they find are much less hierarchical and much more fluid and adaptable than traditional labour union organisation. So here then is perhaps an example of horizontal European integration led by citizen workers themselves, and a form, if you followed my argument so far, of response and reject of authoritarian and closed political tendencies in the workplace itself. And so the European institutions, I would suggest, would benefit in trying to address the causes of populism from stepping down a little bit from their high-level conferences and looking at the ways that workers are organising themselves on the ground, appreciating that the causes of anti-democratic attitudes in Europe are not all to do with unemployment, which is lower than ever, or a lack of jobs, or even a lack of growth, but could also be to do with the kind of work that people are having to do. And two last remarks to prepare myself for the discussion. Firstly, obviously, not everybody in Europe, perhaps not even, but certainly not the majority of people in Europe, work already in companies that look like Amazon or call centres or the gig economy. But this is one of the paradigms, if you like, of the way industry in the European economy is going. Workers in such companies encounter directly every day globalization through their work. So if Europe wants to have a plan for a globalized economy and try to influence what globalization will look like, it needs to try to get ahead of the game rather than constantly trying to catch up with it. And as I say, looking at the ways that the new economy is affecting political attitudes and the way that workers themselves are organising against their alienation to address it would seem to me to be the way to go.